And this is the Nomad Capitalist Report. James Jatras, the principal of Squire Sanders Public Advocacy, repealfatca.com, the website, discussing the Foreign Income Tax Compliance Act, some of the draconian repercussions of this new law passed in the United States, also how the effects of this are ringing around the world. He says $1 trillion in compliance costs possible for foreign financial institutions. James, welcome back. We were discussing exactly how you get into this nexus of being an American. How is it that people can have their accounts closed around the world? You've written that on your website, that Americans who live in other countries, the jurisdictions we talk about, Singapore, Hong Kong, Switzerland, anywhere, no matter where you are, people are having the door shut in their face if they're Americans. But you're saying, even being an American citizen, that's not all it takes.
That's right. It isn't. There are what they call U.S. indices that are relevant to the accounts that the IRS wants identified under FATCA. And they could be even applied to, for example, somebody who is a born and bred native of the country in which he lives, but his account is handled through an American broker. So that account then becomes subject, it should pop up on the best practices culling through the accounts as an index, as a U.S. index for something that should be reportable to the IRS under FATCA. This is where the expense for these institutions comes in, because they've got to design basically a data search system for their accounts to find all of these possible indices of a U.S. connection that need to be reported to the IRS. This is obviously why not only tax lawyers and accountants, but software companies are dancing with glee over the prospect of FATCA, because when we talk about that $1 trillion, it's into those pockets that most of that $1 trillion will go to sell compliance services with this law.
The website is repealfatca.com. You had spoken about the UK. Tell us once again, get into the prospect of other governments and how they work with the United States. Do you really think that the United States is concerned about the repercussions of this, and are other countries? Do you think that these Western democracies, as we call them, still believe that there's really nowhere else for people to put their money? People will comply. It won't have any negative effects.
It is funny. I don't know to what extent they really have thought that through. I mean, looking at it from Treasury's point of view, they didn't write this law. I don't think they really opposed it, but it landed on their lap, and they look at it and say, oh, gosh, we've got to enforce this thing now. Well, on the face of it, it's unenforceable, and they know that. So they came up with this IGA scheme to get other countries to enforce it on themselves. That's not in the law at all. There's no syllable in FATCA itself about doing that. That's something Treasury came up with as the only way to make this workable, and I think they're gambling on the assumption that if they can get enough of our major friends and allies and commercial partners to sign on because they're afraid of the prospect of direct unilateral American enforcement, that will be sufficient to make this thing a go, because I think they're afraid that if they actually have to pull the trigger on unilateral enforcement, it will blow up in their face and in the United States. That if there are billions of dollars that are withdrawn from the American economy because people are afraid of that 30% withholding, this is going to come back to bite them. So I think they're gambling on being on other governments and FFIs being terrified enough that they'll sign on board, quote, voluntarily.
It's an interesting point. As nomad capitalists, it is important, in my opinion, that one goes where they're treated best. It does seem like the prospect, although diminishing, hasn't necessarily hit the United States. The people seem to like the idea of this. If you were to ask average people, if you did a poll, people would like the idea of more reporting, more transparency. They don't particularly seem to be too in tune with people who live overseas. And I think that certainly that is perhaps, if you would agree with me, a benefit or detriment of a country that is so isolated compared to countries like Switzerland, where they are living with the ramifications of being part of a connected world.
I think that's probably right, but this is where I hope people are amenable to common sense arguments. If you say to the average person, don't you think that people who are consciously deliberately hiding money that they know is owable in tax from the taxman, you and I have to pay our taxes, why shouldn't he? Yeah, I can understand that, but this law doesn't do that. It's kind of like prohibition. Nobody's in favor of alcohol abuse, but prohibition was not a very good solution to it. It basically tried to deal with the ordinary person rather than people who are actually, problem drinkers who go cause real problems. That's what you need to focus on. Well, here, what we're doing with FATCA is putting a burden on anybody and everybody else that is going to take money out of the pockets of Americans and people worldwide in compliance costs for financial services and reduced investment in the United States, job loss, all of this, in order to not accomplish the goal of actually catching anybody who's really cheating on their taxes. That's where I think the real problem comes in here. So sure, I can understand that impulse, but you don't do something that isn't going to accomplish that goal and instead is going to inflict harm on everybody else.
In the remaining few minutes, what should people be doing? What should people be doing with their dollars? What should people be doing in terms of responding to this? Obviously, if someone lives in the United States, they should be cognizant of doing business overseas. If someone lives overseas, if someone has those American connections, those indices you mentioned, what should people be aware of in their own situation?
Well, of course, if they do have accounts overseas, there is a form they have to file. I forget the number of the form, but it's a new form for FATCA in addition to the FBAR reporting form. And yeah, I don't recommend anybody get in trouble with the IRS by not complying with what is a current filing requirement. I think the main thing they can do right now is this: if any of the people that are listening to us know people who are in the management of financial institutions, either American or foreign, and they're on a first-name basis with, say, the manager of a bank or of a stock company or something, I hope they can give them a call and say, listen, I know you're worried about this FATCA thing. I just found out about it, but I know you've been worried about this for years. I understand that companies like yours are telling your government to sign an IGA with the United States. Please stop doing that. I understand there's an alternative. Don't sign an agreement with the United States. Don't look at compliance with FATCA as your only alternative. There is a growing awareness of FATCA here in the United States and a growing prospect that we can get this law repealed if we get the kind of support that we need.
Finally, are there repercussions that will be suffered by other countries? Certainly in a country like Hong Kong, there's so much excess liquidity. The local banks really have nowhere to put it. For example, are there other situations like that where these foreign banks really don't care? They're happy to take the Americans out of their system and deal more locally.
Absolutely, and if they got millions of dollars, they're not going to put it someplace where somebody's going to grab 30% of it because they don't like the degree to which you're complying with something. So yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing that's going to hurt Americans worldwide and hurt the American economy and American jobs.
Of course, the best piece of advice, always ask your accountant. James Jatras, RepealFATCA.com, the website. I'm Andrew Henderson. This is the Nomad Capitalist Report.